there's this shift that we all go through where we're trying. I can only imagine what this felt like to you, and I'd love to hear this, but your dad is this amazing human who's changing people's lives, and you really are working in the beginning to show them that you can do this, that you are special, that they did a good job. And then it has to shift at some point in time to that they're not around. Who are we doing this for? And that kind of comes to your first pillar, which is purpose, right? It's that when you find that purpose, how does that drive you to be better?
Yes. And one thing I say about purpose is that it's not for anybody else's approval. And that's the big thing, is that so many people I know are living somebody else's purpose, and whether that might be like, when I say when you're living somebody else's purpose, I'm talking about not feeling as if you're authentic, in the sense that you're somehow doing living a life that is not aligned with what you really want, whether that's you've not married the right person. You like, we see this a lot in South Asian culture, right? Like arranged marriages, even in the United States, they're not as typical, like in the sense that you know the person, you've probably dated them for, maybe a few months before your parents are like, all right, like, you know, that expression SHIT, or get off the pot, right?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
this is so the whole idea is that you're supposed to get married. But the point is, I know so many people who are now like getting divorced because they're like, I didn't want this life, I didn't want this person, I didn't want, I'm married to a woman instead of being married to a man, or whatever it might be. And I feel like that being authentic and taking the time to say, who is this for? Is it for me? Is it for somebody else? And I feel like my parents never put any pressure. They were just like, and it's funny, I was the second child, and so and because I was a girl, and this is where it's funny, as progressive as my parents are, when my mom was, a third daughter in an Indian family in India, where they would cry. Her grandmother literally cried when she was born, because it meant that they had to pay one more dowry. And her father raised her like a man who was like, you're going to get educated. She had a PhD. She had multiple masters, multiple bachelors. She finished high school at 13. As progressive as she was, I feel like in some ways they were like, yeah, yeah, you'll be fine. Their focus was on my older brother. They're like, we got to keep an eye on him. You'll be fine. You do the right thing. So they never really paid a lot of attention to me in some ways. And so I felt like I had to kind of entertain myself at a young age, amuse myself at a young age. And then I just gravitated towards science and the humanities. And to me, psychiatry is the perfect blend of it. Like, I love black and white. I'm very logical and very rational, but I'm also super creative and believe in the art of medicine. And there's no other profession in medicine where you actually get to talk to people. And that is the healing and the talking. And a lot of people were surgeons, they're in it, they fix it, and they're done. And I wanted to have long-standing relationships with people where I knew that, like, just like you said, giving them that attention and love and focus and these very high value conversations where I'm listening, and I'm listening to every word they're saying, how they're saying it, reading in between the lines, the interpretation and of everything they've told me. And then putting in sort of my spin of, I'm hearing this, I want to reflect this back to you. What are the goals? And how is the life you're living matching up to those goals? So purpose is about just being very intentional, very deliberate, and also very authentic.
Yeah, and I've watched several of your reels, and I love that you mentioned how challenging sometimes and difficult it is, because we do these reels and we do all this stuff on social media, and we did grow up without it. So like, it's not a part of our lives. Where my sons, like, they are so worried about what they post and how they post it, and they're not worried about the result, but but they definitely think through the processes. And I'm like, if it's authentic, I'm putting it out there. If I mess up, it's okay. I'm imperfect. Like, this is who I am and what we do. But it really comes down to, when you're out there putting yourself out there and you're talking about purpose, purpose is not something, I've heard you say, that will just strike you. Sometimes you have to actually go out and find it, and talk to our listeners a little bit about that. Like, it's got to be something we work for, right?
Yes, yes. And I feel like, good for you, good for the person who knew from a young age, if they were like a musician, or an artist. Like, a lot of times people will say, I was good at it. And then also they had, luckily, a parent that had the time to invest. If I could think about an Olympic athlete or pro tennis player, like everything aligned where they were good at it, or their parent had a vision for them. And they also had, hundreds of hours and financial resources to put behind them, because it really takes a dedicated parent. And I want to hear about how your son ended up in the soccer academy. And I'm sure you and your wife must have had a big hand, I think. I don't know, you'll tell me. But we do have to go out and find it, because especially like a person might say, I feel like I'm not challenged. I hear this all the time. I'm bored at my job. I feel numb. I'm not growing. And there's a concept of role remake. So like if you are working for someone and you want to continue working for them, is there any aspect of your job that can be changed or modified to bring you greater joy? Does that joy have to come from your daytime hours? Because it doesn't, right? Like when you talked about impact, it could be from your day job, but that impact could also be in the evening hours or on the weekends. And whether it's a side hustle, and most people have one now, and then letting your side hustle grow and see where that takes you. Sometimes people feel like they need to quit the day job to do the side hustle. I mean, there's so many layers to that. I mean, you need financial support or whatever it might be, but don't give up. And I think that when we stop growing, right, is when life is over. Like growth always has to be a part of your life, and that could come in the form of listening to podcasts. What inspires you? And you don't have to make money off the bat. You can say, I'm just going to do this for fun. And then let's see where this goes. And if there's traction, take courses, take classes, whatever it is that you're interested in. And I have patients who will, someone who works in, a big tech company, and then on the side, she's taking yoga, instructing classes and aromatherapy, all sorts of interesting things. And at the end, she realized, I did it. I'm glad I did it. But it's not what I want to pursue. And then, leaving this stable tech job is now, doing, entrepreneur food industry. And so I just think that creativity has to be a part of it, and keep learning, keep searching, keep talking to people, going to seminars. But don't accept the status quo if you are feeling stagnant.
Yeah. So I think it's so important. I think a lot of young people today believe that they're going to be struck by lightning and they'll find their purpose. And or they try to live a purpose that they think the world will love, not what they love. And purpose and anything that we find impactful. We started the conversation before we even started recording about almost talking about what I like to call giving is selfish. Like, you are giving of yourself to a patient at 6:30 in the morning, and he needs to talk to you. It starts his day. It's almost like a personal trainer. You're telling the story. And the reality is you're telling it in a way that of how you're receiving something, growth, impact, purpose, opportunity. Like, it changes the way that you see the world. And I see that as so powerful. And I think that's something that so many people don't maybe understand yet.
Yes. Yes. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because I feel like one big part of purpose, I think that if you really want, if you ask me, and this may sound, biased, because there are people who are like, I love what I do and I don't necessarily give to anyone. At some point, that life is going to be empty. That in some form, your purpose could be, should be, to help other people. And there's so many studies on the benefits of volunteering and altruism. And one of the studies I talk about in the book is that there's a study of adolescents who were volunteering, and they were like helping younger kids with their homework, after school activities, and they ended up having less inflammation and therefore less cardiac disease later in life. And you might think like, wow, that seemed like so minuscule. And yet they find a Lancet study showed that people who have a purpose are 30% less likely to die or have heart attacks or have strokes over an 8.5 year period. And when that purpose is tied to giving back in some form, like to me, there's no greater satisfaction in life. And like, if you can find a way where that happens to be how you make your living or not, it doesn't matter. There were so many days I remember growing up where my parents' living room would be filled with random people who were looked at my parents as leaders. And in the South Asian community, people would not seek help professionally. So they would come to my dad, and he would do so much pro bono work. And they would say, my son is having panic, attacks. Like, can you talk to him? And my dad would eventually say, listen, at some point you need to see a specialist. Like, and I'm going to give you the name of, these colleagues, and whether it's sliding scale, whether, and he also started a clinic. And both my parents, my mom had started a school in India in the 60s, which grew out of her living room to 1,000 students. And the two prime ministers got involved because it was a model school of integrating kids with disabilities into mainstream classrooms, which was unheard of back then. So they were always helping people and got nothing financially out of it. And both had done so much work, I would say equivalent to their full-time paid gigs, community work. And I look back and, my husband jokes, he's like, I don't get it. Like, I look back and he's like, me and you were working, we have jobs, we help people, and at the same time, how did your parents have another 40 hours a week to do all of these side things that made them no money? He's like, I don't know, like that's so impressive. And they were some of they were married, my mom before she died, they were married 45 years and they both supported each other. Both were badasses. And to see that love and to be like, that's what I want. I want that's what true partnership is, where I support. And that's unheard of in those days, like men sort of expected women to be subservient and that, so it was the model of you can be a great mother, you can find fulfillment professionally, and you can also give back. And her giving was so much more. And so, in some ways I do look back and I'm like, my first job was working with my mom at 11 in this school that she had started in the evening. So her day job was working for the Board of Ed, a New York Board of Ed, and then in the evening had started this Indian Cultural Institute. And that was my first job, is teaching kids who were like my age or just a few years younger Hindi, which I had learned in India because they dragged us to live in India for 2 years because they wanted to continue their mission work. And, in those days I was like, where's the electricity? Where's the Saturday morning cartoons? There's no like American food here. I mean, now it's changed enormously, but I was always part of their purpose, and so part of it was, and I talk about the concept in my book, is this word dharma, which is about it's a Sanskrit word for duty, obligation. And I talk about how that conflicts with very much the like American Western approach. And I was born and raised in the United States. And it was, here we're like, go be you, be fabulous, independent. And in India or in that South Asian culture, it's interdependence. And I feel like that's what we're missing when we have this loneliness crisis and mental health crisis. It's because of this extreme idea, self-reliance, that we have to solve all of this by ourselves. And when we look at how the CDC talks about suicide rates have gone up 30% in 30 years, it's because they cite it and pin it to self-reliance, this hyper independence idea. And I talk about in the chapter on people. So there's 8 pillars and people is one of them. And it's all about relationships, interpersonal relationships, relationship with yourself, something called like developing an intentional aloneness practice, which is enjoying your own company. But I talk a lot about the importance of interdependence and valuing our relationships, which is something I feel like is really missing. The quality of our relationships, especially amongst young people, is getting watered down.
If you like clips like this, I have a similar clip here. And if you want to watch the full video, click here.